I had always believed that the classical civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome were the direct predecessors of Western civilization. I was not alone in such a belief. This is the traditional perspective in the study of history, and it is quite logical. Greek philosophy is seen as the foundation of Western philosophy. Western nations have adopted classical systems of government, such as democracy and republicanism, and some even use neoclassical architecture to denote government buildings. Furthermore, the Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages, spanning much of Europe, quite literally considered itself the continuation of that classical Roman Empire. Even the realm of religion appears to be directly related. The Greco-Roman paganism of antiquity and the Viking Age paganism both share a common Indo-European ancestor, and the Christianity that replaced paganism in both antiquity and the Middle Ages was Roman Catholicism. All of these examples strongly point to modern Europe being descended from Greece and Rome, and I personally never suspected that this was not the case. Then I read Oswald Spengler's early 20th century book, The Decline of the West, which introduced me to a completely different perspective. According to Spengler, cultures are organisms with life cycles, and the classical organism is entirely different from the Western one. This idea allowed me to answer a problem that had been following me throughout my study of history, the true significance of the Middle Ages. I have always been fascinated by the Middle Ages, and I have always believed that the once widely held belief that it was a period of pure stagnation only reversed by the Renaissance, bringing the extinct classical culture back into Europe, was a harsh idea that did not account for many of the interesting qualities of the Middle Ages, such as chivalry. Spengler's belief that Western culture and classical culture are two different cultures allowed me to reconcile the Middle Ages' place in history. Instead of being a period between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern European states, it was instead the period marking the development of a new culture amidst the ruins of Rome that allowed for the formation of those modern European states, states fundamentally different from the classical states. Spengler believes this is clearly visible in the fundamental differences between how classical and Western cultures perceive the world. The classical observes the tangible and the present, whereas the Western seeks the infinite. Hence, Spengler calls the classical culture the Apollinian, and the Western the Faustian. To understand the first, think of Nietzsche's description of Apollonian in The Birth of Tragedy. Apollo creates the illusion of clear form, which hides the real chaos at the foundation of the world. This allows people to easily understand it. To understand Faustian, think of it as representing Goethe's Faust bargaining with the devil for infinite power. As a result of this different approach to viewing the world, Westerners saw it through the lens of the past and the future, whereas classical people saw it through the lens of the present. This divergence cannot be attributed to the people of the classical era not being exposed to any technology related to the conception of time. Spengler states, quote, "Although classical man was well acquainted with the strict chronology and almanac reckoning of the Babylonians, and especially the Egyptians, and therefore with that eternity sense and disregard of the present as such, which revealed itself in their broadly conceived operations of astronomy and their exact measurements of big time intervals. None of this ever became intimately a part of him. What his philosophers occasionally told him on the subject, they had heard, not experienced, and what a few brilliant minds in the Asiatic Greek cities, such as Hipparchus and Aristarchus, discovered was rejected alike by the Stoic and the Aristotelian, and outside a small professional circle, not even noticed. Neither Plato nor Aristotle had an observatory. In the last years of Pericles, the Athenian people passed a decree by which all who propagated astronomical theories were made liable to impeachment. This last was an act of the deepest symbolic significance expressive of the determination of the classical soul to banish distance, in every aspect, from its world consciousness." End quote. Spengler provides a plethora of examples that demonstrate the cultural difference between the classical and the Western. I will focus on the following: memorials, history, storytelling, diplomacy, expansion, architecture, art, math, and money. Regarding the first, the way the dead are memorialized is completely different between the two cultures. Spengler states, quote, "It was the spirit of the Vikings and the Hansa, As of those dim people, so unlike the Hellenes was their domestic funerary urns, who heaped up great barrows as memorials of the lonely soul on the wide plains. It was the spirit of those who sent their dead kings to sea in their burning ships, thrilling manifest of their dark yearning for the boundless. End quote. Spengler highlights how that yearning has led Westerners to chronicle the history of all things, whereas historians in the classical age possessed only the memory of recent generations, reflecting their focus on the present. Spengler's analysis of the Greek historian Thucydides emphasizes the stark contrast between the two perspectives. Spengler states, quote, "As for Thucydides, his lack of historical feeling, in our sense of the phrase, is conclusively demonstrated on the very first page of his book by the astounding statement that before his time, about 400 BC, no events of importance had occurred in the world." End quote. Like history, Spengler views storytelling also as dramatically differing between the two cultures. Apollinian society always repeated the same familiar heroic stories, such as those about Hercules, whereas the Faustian was constantly driven toward new ones, from King Arthur to the massive catalogs of stories that exist today. Spengler believes that the same desire for the familiar that led the classical culture to maintain the same stories also caused classical cities to fight each other over the most minor differences. Think about how ancient Greece was not united, but instead a battleground between the cities of Athens and Sparta and others. In contrast, Western societies maintained diplomatic channels with each other, as the horizon expanded beyond the local. This naturally infinite horizon of the Western culture compared to the limited one of the classical meant that they expanded in ways entirely different from one another. In the classical context, it was a replication of the familiar in already known areas, whereas for the Western, it was a desire to explore. Spengler states, quote, "While the Spaniards and the Portuguese were possessed by the adventure craving for uncharted distances and for everything unknown and dangerous, the Greeks went carefully, point by point, on the known tracks of the Phoenicians and Etruscans, and their curiosity in no wise extended to what lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules and the Isthmus of Suez, easily accessible as both were to them. Athens no doubt heard of the way to the North Sea, to the Congo, to Zanzibar, to India. In Nero's time, the position of the southern extremity of India was known. Also, that of the islands of Sunda, but Athens shut its eyes to these things, just as it did to the astronomical knowledge of the Old East. Even when the lands that we call Morocco and Portugal had become Roman provinces, no Atlantic voyaging ensued, and the Canaries remained forgotten. Apollinian man felt the Columbus longing as little as he felt the Copernican. Possessed though the Greek merchants were with the desire of gain, a deep metaphysical shyness restrained them from extending the horizon. And in geography, as in other matters, they stuck to near things and the foregrounds. The existence of the polis, that astonishing ideal of the state as statue, was in truth nothing more nor less than a refuge from the wide world of the sea peoples. And that though the classical, alone of all the cultures so far, had a ring of coast about a sea of islands, and not a continental expanse as its motherland, not even Hellenism, with all its proneness to technical diversions, freed itself from the oared ship which tethered the mariner to the coast. The naval architects of Alexandria were capable of constructing giant ships of 260 feet in length, and for that matter, the steamship was discovered in principle. But there are some discoveries that have all the pathos of a great and necessary symbol, and reveal depths within, and there are others that are merely play of intellect. The steamship is for Apollinians one of the latter, and for Faustians one of the former class. It is prominence or insignificance in the macrocosm as a whole that gives discovery and the application thereof the character of depth or shallowness." End quote. Spengler also believed the significance of expansion was completely different for the two cultures, stating, quote, "The discoveries of Columbus and Vasco da Gama extended the geographical horizon without limit, and the world sea came into the same relation with land as that of the universe of space with earth. And then, first the political tension within the Faustian world, consciousness, discharged itself. For the Greeks, Hellas was and remained the important part of the Earth's surface. But with the discovery of America, West Europe became a province in a gigantic whole. Thenceforward, the history of the Western culture has a planetary character. End quote. Naturally, such a different view of the world led to the two cultures creating different architecture. The classical style uses clear, simple forms and stays low to the ground, thus representing both form and limits, whereas the Western style uses complex forms and extends towards the sky, representing the transcending of forms and the effort to expand to infinity. Additionally, classical cities usually restrict the distance between buildings and people by using narrow, winding streets, whereas newer Western cities aim to create long, wide streets that emphasize distance. Furthermore, in art, the classical statue emphasizes the tangible human body, whereas the Western portrait emphasizes its subject's emotions. Additionally, while classical statues focus solely on youth, avoiding age and thus the concept of time, Western portraits are unafraid to include imperfections, such as wrinkles, to demonstrate the subject's relation to time. The classical fresco avoids expressing distance, prioritizing a flat, plain surface. In contrast, Western painting expands into an infinite distance. Even the color choices in art, Spengler argues, reflect this difference. The reds and yellows in classical art represent easily expressed and understood emotions, like anger and passion, whereas the greens and blues in Western art represent the infinite, expansive landscapes and the sky, respectively. Spengler draws a particularly strong contrast between the music of both cultures. He believes that classical music was meant to be clear and directly tied to the player, not transcending the player. For Westerners, music transcends all forms and expands into infinity. Even mathematics and finances demonstrate the difference. The classical focused on magnitudes, numbers representing objects that could actually be seen in real life and easily counted, and tangible geometry. The Western, on the other hand, instead of focusing on math that could be easily represented in the real world, used functions to represent highly complex ideas distant from everyday life. Most significantly, calculus seeks to represent the infinite. Spengler views the coin as a tangible form of money that fits the classical culture but was adopted in the Western culture. He sees the abstract forms of money that transcend tangible physical wealth as better representative of Western culture. However, the fact that the coin still entered Western culture among the many other cultural transfers mentioned in the introduction to this video points to another one of Spengler's ideas. He believes that Western culture shows a strong interest in classical culture, owing to the fundamental differences between the local and the infinite. The saying opposites attract describes this well. However, Spengler argues that ideas adopted from classical culture were misunderstood in ways that aligned more closely with Western culture. He views this as particularly visible in the Renaissance, when Westerners sought to revive the classical. For example, Spengler sees through Michelangelo's Pieta's outward appearance as a classical statue, and sees its inner Western soul through its portrayal of the idea of the mother and the child, which Spengler views as a Western symbol representing the expansion of generations into the infinite. Another great example of this is Spengler's observation that classical philosophers were content with their philosophies in and of themselves, whereas Western philosophers, who despite seeing themselves as being descended of the classical tradition, were combative, believing that others should follow their ideas. This same Western attitude, Spengler believes, was transferred to Christianity, originating in the Magian culture, his term for the various Middle Eastern cultures he sees as sharing common themes. Spengler argues that in his Magian form, Christianity was about inner transformation, but in his Western form, it was about expanding the religion in terms of reach and numbers of followers. The question may be asked, how did Western culture emerge if it is not of the older classical culture? Spengler believes that the Northern Europeans in their earliest stages, think of the early Germanic tribes, were possessed by the idea of the infinite due to their environment with its endless dark forest. It is perhaps easiest to grasp this cultural idea by observing the Norse of the Viking Age, who, while influenced by Rome, still held closest to the original form of the Western culture. The gods of their religion, unlike the Greek and Roman gods who existed in tangible locations on Earth, instead resided in distant realms like Asgard, emphasizing the infinite over the near and tangible. Furthermore, the Norse were driven to seek the infinite in their own lives, traveling by ship to countless faraway lands, including Iceland, Greenland, Canada, Sicily, and Russia. Spengler draws a sharp contrast here to the classical culture. Quote, "The spirit of the Norsemen drove their cockle boats in the 10th century that heralded the Faustian birth to the coast of America, but to the circumnavigation of Africa already achieved by Egyptians and Carthaginians, classical mankind was wholly indifferent." End quote. Ultimately, these cultures would all interact with each other. Germanic tribes who moved south came into contact with classical culture through the Roman Empire, which also harbored many aspects of Magian culture, such as Magian spirituality. As a result, Westerners, already interested in the infinite, came into contact with two other cultures whose ideas they interpreted through a different perspective. Thus, an identity was created with strong links to both the classical and the Magian cultures, but while maintaining a fundamentally differing focus and soul. Although there is a difference in focus between classical and Western culture, some parallels can be drawn. Spengler believed that cultural organisms such as both the classical and the Western go through the same stages, with a distinction being drawn between the earlier cultural stage and the later civilizational stage. Culture is the lively and spiritual stage of life in the countryside village. Think of beautiful architecture, new religions, whereas civilization is the stage of the giant world city, wherein all that inner development has been fulfilled, and the only thing left to do is to materially expand. For example, creating massive skyscrapers instead of meaningful architectural styles, and expanding the domain of a particular state while not expanding the significance of its inner culture. According to this perspective, the ancient Greeks better represent the cultural stage through their spirituality and art and their simultaneous reluctance to expand. Rome, on the other hand, represents the civilization stage, for it expanded the reach and material abundance of that Hellenic culture. This transition between the Greeks and the Romans is evident in Alexander the Great, who began expanding Hellenic civilization through his conquest. This idea of a transition between Greece and Rome helped me understand why some thinkers, like Nietzsche, had a great love for ancient Greece, but a strong antipathy toward Rome, despite the two appearing quite similar on the surface. Nietzsche, a thinker focused on the development of the individual's values, would have seen in Greece a culture at a similar stage and a similar emphasis, whereas in Rome, he would have seen inner stagnation. Though Rome was expanding and grander in its material excess, such matters of state power were not Nietzsche's focus. Likewise, Westerners were in their cultural phase during the Middle Ages, but entered the civilizational stage during the Napoleonic era. This is why Faustian culture now seeks to expand to the limits, but without the cultural richness it once had. Clearly visible in the skyscraper and the development of artificial intelligence, which is capable of highly efficient work but creates work removed from the person and the culture. This is in sharp contrast to the Norse and Gothic Christians, who represented the early spiritual cultural phase with their strong passion, rich religious beliefs, and art. Thus, while Faustian and Apollinian are two separate entities, if we are to look at the development of culture to civilization as described by Spengler, the modern world is more similar to Rome, exercising material might but cultural stagnation, not ancient Greece, which represents the same stage as early Westerners, emphasizing material restriction but cultural development. Thank you for watching this video to the end. That helps with the algorithm immensely. As always, if anyone is familiar with the topics discussed in this video and identifies any mistakes or missing relevant information, please leave a comment highlighting the issue. Finally, I would highly recommend reading Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West for yourself. In the comments section, I have pinned a comment that will direct you to the book on the free book service, Project Gutenberg. That way, you can hear Spengler's ideas in his own voice, and thus have a better idea of his beliefs than what a video essay can achieve.